Hello.
Hello.
Hello. So today we're here to talk about white privilege, and it's very much a case of we're here to teach and learn at the same time. So we're going to try and talk about a few of our experiences and what we think white privilege is and all the rest of it. So I'll pass over to Miss Wild.
We're going to talk about white privilege, but we're also going to talk about what it's not. Because the word privilege, when you think about it, makes you think about wealth. And a lot of people think that I might come from a wealthy background because of the way I sound. My accent makes me sound like I come from a wealthy or rich background. And I don't at all. I come from a really poor background. But white privilege is not about wealth. It's not about whether or not you're rich or poor. It's about an invisible advantage that you have regardless of whether you're poor or rich. This is Jefferson.
Yeah, linking back to what Ms Wild said, the idea of white privilege links to bias. So it links to the fact that unconsciously we might look at people in a certain way and not be aware that we're making a particular judgment or having a particular thought about them. And because the dominant racial group in Britain for many years has been white, if you're a white person living in this society, you're not going to be aware of privileges that you have because you can't see them. So, for example, if any of you watched Noughts and Crosses when it was on the BBC recently, and I know lots of people here have read it, there's a really sort of moving part in that story where a white boy cuts himself and has to get a plaster, and the black girl gives him a plaster, and the plaster is black. And it's because in that society, the people who control the society, the people who have the power, are the black people, and the white people are the people who have been suppressed. And that tiny moment when the plaster that you're given doesn't match the colour of your skin is a moment where, in Noughts and Crosses, you would say it was black privilege, because it's a culture which is dominating, or a group of people which is dominating another group of people. Another example might be makeup. So for many, many years, if you had black skin and you were trying to buy foundation, it was pretty much impossible to get yourself foundation in a shop. It's absolutely harrowing sometimes if you talk to young girls about the toys they might have access to. You used to go into a toy shop. Now you'll go in a toy shop and you'll see babies and dolls and toys that are different colours. But it used to be that they were all white. Sir.
I think that's sorry. I think that's really interesting because there are things that you're not aware of, or I'm not aware of when I might try and go and buy makeup. Not that I do very often. So I walk in and I'm not conscious of the fact that the display is set up for me. Because it's set up for me, it doesn't occur to me that it's there for me. And you're only aware of it if it's not set up for you. And that's where the invisibleness of white privilege comes up. Sorry, Mr. Cox.
No, that's all right. So for me, where I grew up in the north of England, as you might well know from my accent. And I didn't see another person of colour in my hometown until I was at least 15. So growing up with a solely white community and not having met anybody else, there was always we had shops where people would work who might have been of colour, and they'd always be known as a certain type of shop. And I didn't know that was wrong, calling it that certain type of shop. So it took me quite a long time. I think it must have been when I was about 17 before I realised what I was actually saying was wrong. But that's just a fallout of sort of the culture that I grew up in, with it being everybody being white and everybody saying that same thing. I saw that as the sort of status quo, but that was so wrong. And it's still very much like that a lot of the time up in the north to this day, which is a real shame. But at least, you've got people like myself who come from that sort of background who are trying to change the status quo. And I know a few of my friends are exactly the same up there as well. So it took me to go to university essentially to realise that what white privilege was, in a sense. It wasn't called white privilege when I went to university. This is sort of a newfangled term in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, but it's very much grown and expanded over the past few years because more people are starting to listen and take sort of an interest in what it means, and that's how it's come about for me as well. But yeah, growing up in the north, I was very privileged to grow up being a white person, yes, I grew up in poverty for quite a lot of it, but my parents then managed to get us out of that. But that might not necessarily have been the case whether, sorry, excuse me, if they also had the racial stereotypes to deal with as well. So
I think that's the thing, isn't it, Mr. Cox? That privilege is not saying that your parents' hard work is not, they didn't deserve what they got through the hard work. It's recognizing that if they've been poor and black as well as poor, then it would have been that bit harder for them than it was for them anyway.
It's not only the issue of dealing with being poor, which there's a very big systematic system in place at the moment that keeps people poor, but to add somebody's race on top of that as well, it quashes them even further, and it's a really difficult thing to discuss as well. Being a white man, ultimately in the world, being a Western white male, I am physically the most powerful person in the world according to social stereotypes and all the rest of it. So for me I'm still learning every day with this. I trip over myself. So when school is back in order, if I ever say something that you would feel as white privilege and I trip over myself, I want somebody to highlight that to me, because I need to learn as well. It's not that I know exactly what's right and wrong, because this is all new to me as well. And I'm, like I say, I'm 100% behind the whole Black Lives Matter movement, but I know I will trip up and I know that I will need correcting. And, because of my white privilege, I'll need that to be pointed out to me.
I also think, sir, like you said, the term white privilege, you said it was a newfangled term. It's actually been in use for some time, and its definition has changed over time. But it's a term that people have become aware of in the mainstream in the past 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
And that's because society and the way that we talk and think about things is changing really rapidly. And I would argue changing in a really beneficial way in terms of our awareness of the rights of LGBT peoples, of transgender people. That actually what you have is people wanting to make a more inclusive world and make a safer community for everybody. And that's what we want you guys to do. But the stuff that we're trying to talk about is really hard to talk about. So as Mr. Cox was saying there, it's like sometimes I feel like I stumble over my words and I feel like I don't know quite what to say in case I say the wrong thing. And I think that's another thing for all of us to be aware of, that it's okay to say the wrong thing because we're all trying to learn. As long as you say the wrong thing and somebody goes, hang on a minute, and you go, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that, and then we can work it out. It's not a problem. So white privilege is essentially, how would you define it, Ms Wild? It's essentially,
I think it's the invisible things that you don't realize that you have because you're white. And I mean, I was talking to my son who's 7 about this, and I was talking about the privileges that he has. And he initially said, I don't know that I have any privileges. And I started to highlight things to him, that he has food whenever he wants it and stuff like that he's not aware of because he doesn't not have it. So for me, it's those becoming aware of the things that you have as a matter of course as a white person.
Yeah. I think it was something interesting as well that Mr. Cox mentioned to me once about his mum, that there's a sense, you said it at the start, Ms Wild, the word privilege is problematic because it makes people who have had difficult times in their life think, which is part of where the All Lives Matter movement comes from. Black Lives Matter isn't saying that Black lives are more important than anybody else's lives. What they're saying is they're trying to raise awareness of the inequality and the injustice that has persisted for many years. But there are lots of people across the country who hear that message and think, well, what about me? And don't you understand where I came from? And actually, Mr. Cox was talking about his mum who was Irish and when she first moved to the north and the experiences she had. What was it that you were telling us, sir?
Yeah, so when my mum moved over from Northern Ireland, a little town called Derry, or Londonderry, depending on your political persuasion, which is a totally different thing we could talk about another time. But when she moved over, because she had big ginger hair, had a funny accent and all the rest of it, she was different. So she was different to everybody in that working class town of Middlesbrough, which is where they moved to, and where I'm ultimately from. So my mum has 4 brothers and then herself. and they went to a school around the corner from where they lived. And on the way to and from school, all of them would get things thrown at them, whether it be a football boot, stones, or bottles, or whatever, or people would say racial slurs to them, and all the rest of it. But they were white, and it was, that's another thing that I'm trying to wrap my head around, the fact that they came over and they were still seen as somebody who was a target purely because of their race. So obviously there's that sort of incorporated into the whole white privilege thing as well.
Something that astonishes us when we teach Seamus Heaney's poetry to our GCSE students, and we talk about the troubles and the conflict in Northern Ireland, that a lot of students don't know anything about it. And actually that's why one of the things our school's going to be doing is looking at working with the One Bristol curriculum to look at decolonising the curriculum, which means making people aware of stories that took place, of things that happened in addition to the things you're already taught. Because the signs that would be displayed prominently on bed and breakfasts and boarding houses in the 60s and 70s would famously say no blacks, no dogs, no Irish.
Yeah.
And that's, I don't have words for it. There's no words for it to describe how abhorrent, how hideous that is, that somebody felt they could put a sign up and say that about groups of people. And I'm losing my words, and I suppose I'm losing my words because what we're trying to talk about is the fact that we're having conversations that people don't normally have. And we're having conversations where we're trying as adults to make sense of really complex ideas and things that are floating around in the world. And I guess all we can keep coming back to is that we want to listen to each other, we want to listen to you, and we want to learn from one another, right like Mr. Cox said at the beginning. So in terms of what is white privilege, if you find it something difficult to understand, that's because it is difficult to understand, and that's okay. But go back to what we said right at the start of our work on this, when Mrs. Ringer and Mrs. Robinson and I had a conversation, and we said we want you to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And that's again what we've tried to model today. Would you agree, sir? That's the best thing we can do, is put ourselves in someone else's shoes.
Yeah, it's all a conversation to be had, isn't it? Like, white privilege is such a fluid thing, and it's always going to be changing. And we as a human race, almost, we all need to grow together. We all need to take that step up together, and this conversation is part of that. And it is difficult, and I know some people will probably be offended by some of the things that we've said in this, but if you can highlight that to us, and there's different ways that we can say things, by all means let us know, because like I say, we are here to learn as well. So
superb. Thank you so much, Mr. Cox. I think that's really thoughtful, and I've certainly learned just talking to you two this afternoon, and I hope that you listening have found it interesting and thought-provoking. And as Mr. Cox says, please tell us if there's things you want us to reflect on.
Thank you very much for listening, guys. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.